Chapter 15 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes, by G. A. Henty. Chapter 15. Ameres is Revenged. 6 days passed without their watch being rewarded. Then Chebron, whose post was just opposite the road where they had traced the wheels, saw a chariot turn from the main road into it. As many others had taken that course every day, he did not at first feel very hopeful, although the time precisely tallied with that at which Plexo should have arrived had he started at the same hour as before. As it came near, however, he became convinced that it was the vehicle he was looking for. The horses tallied in color with those of Plexo, and the color of his dress could even at that distance be distinguished. This time, however, he was not accompanied by a servant, but by a figure the whiteness of whose garment showed him also to be a priest. "That must be Ptylus," he said to himself, "my father's murderer. Would I were down by the edge of the road with my bow and arrows. High priest as he has now become, I would send an arrow through his heart." The chariot turned off by the road parallel to that which had been followed from Thebes, and so close to the foot of the hills that from Chebron's post he could no longer see it. As soon as it was out of sight he leaped to his feet and hurried along the hills to join Amuba, whose post was next to his own. He found his friend had already gone on, and he hurried breathlessly on until he reached Jethro, who had been joined by Amuba a few minutes before. "Have you seen them?" he exclaimed. "I have seen them and marked them down," Jethro replied. "You see that roof among those trees at the foot of the hill half a mile further along? They turned off the road and entered these trees. Our search is over at last." "What had we better do, Jethro? Wait until they have left again and then go down?" "No," Jethro said sternly. "There are two things to be done. The one is to rescue Mysa, the other to punish the murderer of Ameres. But even did we determine to delay our vengeance, I should say we must still press on. You saw that arch villain Ptylus with his son. He has assuredly come for some purpose. Probably he may intend to terrify the girl until he drives her into taking some solemn oath that she will accept Plexo as her husband. What can a girl of that age do in the hands of unscrupulous villains like these? It may be that this fox Plexo has been trying flattery, and, finding that failed, has called in Ptylus, who can threaten her with the anger of these gods of hers, to say nothing of perpetual imprisonment and harsh treatment. We will therefore push on at once. Amuba and I carry our stout peasant staves, while you, Chebron, have your dagger concealed under that female dress. We shall have all the advantage of surprise in our favor. It is not likely that there are more than 1 or 2 men there, with perhaps a female servant. Ptylus would not wish the secret to be known to more than was absolutely necessary. Of course it is possible that the 4 men who carried her off may all be on guard there, but if so, it makes but 6, and what with the surprise, and what with their not knowing how numerous we are, that number should not be more than sufficient for us to dispose of without difficulty. At any rate, were there 20 I would not hesitate. Honest men need never fear an encounter with rogues." "Especially," Amuba said, "when the honest men possess such sinews as yours, Jethro, and a good heavy cudgel in their hands." Jethro smiled, but was in too earnest a mood to answer, and at once led the way along the hillside until immediately behind the house among the trees. Then they descended, climbing with some difficulty over the wall surrounding the wood, and entered the enclosure. Treading as lightly as possible, Jethro and his companions passed through the wood and made their way up to the house. It was small but handsomely built, and was surrounded with a colonnade supported by carved pillars. The garden immediately around it was evidently carefully tended, and the house, from its secluded position, was well fitted as a place of sojourn for a wealthy priest or noble desirous of a few days' rest and retirement from the bustle of the great city. As all were barefooted they passed across the garden to the colonnade without the slightest sound. As they reached it Jethro held up his hand for them to stop, for the sound of voices came through the wide doorway of an apartment opening out to the colonnade. Both Chebron and Amuba at once recognized the voice of Ptylus. "I will put up with no more of this folly, Mysa. You should think yourself fortunate in the extreme in the position in which you are, belonging to a disgraced family, to receive such an offer as my son makes to you. "I will have an answer at once. You will either swear before the gods that you accept Plexo as your future husband, that you will reply to all who question you that you have been staying here by your own free will, and that you remained in concealment simply because you were overwhelmed with horror at the terrible act of sacrilege committed by your brother, or you will this night be confined in a tomb, where you will remain alone and without the light of day until you agree to my conditions. You don't think, you little fool, that I, Tylus, high priest of Osiris, am to be thwarted in my plans by the opposition of a child like you." Here a voice, which the three listeners recognized to their surprise as that of Ruth, broke out. "Do not listen to him, Mysa. Whatever comes of it, never consent to lie before God as this wicked man would have you. You call yourself a high priest, sir. What must be the worth of the gods you pretend to worship if they suffer one like you to minister to them? Were they gods, and not mere images of stone, they would strike you dead at the altar." A furious exclamation broke from Ptylus, and he stepped forward and seized the Hebrew girl roughly by the shoulder, only to start back with another exclamation as Ruth struck him with her open hand with all her force on the cheek. "Drag her hence, Plexo!" he exclaimed. But at this moment the entrance was darkened, and the three listeners sprang into the room. Ptylus had the courage that distinguished his race, and although for a moment startled at the sudden entry he did not recoil, but drawing a sword from his girdle he said haughtily: "Who are you, and what means this intrusion?" "We are those whom you have been hunting to death, Ptylus, and we come here as avengers of blood. As you brought about the murder of Ameres, so you must die, to say naught of your offense in carrying off the daughter of the man you slew." Without a word Ptylus rushed upon Jethro with his sword, thinking to make short work of this insolent peasant, but as he did so Jethro whirled his massive club round his head, and catching the blow upon it, shivered the sword in pieces. Ptylus stopped his arm, and gazing steadily at his opponent, said: "Wretch, do you dare to murder the high priest of Osiris?" "No," Jethro said, "but I dare to execute him," and he brought his heavy club down with all his strength upon the head of the priest. At this moment Plexo, who had stolen unobserved from the room the instant the others entered, returned, followed by three armed men. Chebron and Amuba were so intent upon the combat between Jethro and the priest that they did not notice the entrance of Plexo, who, with uplifted knife, sprang upon Chebron. There was a scream of warning, and quick as thought Ruth sprang forward and pushed Plexo as he sprang through the air. The sudden shock threw both to the ground. Ruth sprang to her feet again, but Plexo lay there motionless. The three armed men stood for a moment stupefied at the fall of their two employers, and then, seeing two men and a woman, rushed forward to attack them. One sweeping blow with Jethro's staff felled the first of his assailants to the ground, the others paused irresolute. "Drop your weapons, or you are dead men!" Jethro exclaimed. "You are outnumbered, and if you move, you die." As Chebron had now thrown back his female robe and drawn his dagger, and taken his place at the door, while Jethro and Amuba were advancing against them, the two men dropped their weapons. "Hold out your hands," Jethro said. "My son, stand over them with your club, and break the skull of either who may move." The men did as they were ordered. Jethro tore strips of cloth off their garments, twisted them into ropes, and bound their wrists firmly together. The meaning tone in which Jethro had called Amuba his son had not escaped either Amuba or Chebron, who saw that Jethro was desirous of concealing their names. Mysa, who had raised a cry of joy when Jethro first spoke, had sunk terrified upon a couch, and had hidden her face in her hands during the short encounter, while Ruth had stood silent and vigilant beside her, moving only when Plexo rushed at Chebron, and retiring to Mysa's side again as soon as she had regained her feet. She, too, understood Jethro's motives in calling Amuba his son, and stooping over Mysa she said: "It is all over now, Mysa, but remain quiet at present. Do not speak until you see what is going to be done." As soon as the men were tied, Jethro secured in the same manner the man who was lying stunned from his blow. Then he turned to Plexo, who had not moved since he had fallen. He half turned him round, and uttered a low exclamation of surprise. "Gastrion," he said to Chebron, "go with the young lady into the garden, and remain there until we join you." Chebron passed out on to the colonnade, following Mysa and Ruth. The moment they were unobserved Mysa threw her arms round him, and burst into tears with joy.
"Oh, Chebron," she exclaimed, "you have arrived just in time. I thought we were never going to get away from that dreadful man, and I don't know what I should have done if it hadn't been for Ruth. And oh, they have been telling me such terrible things! But they can't be true, that our dear father had been killed, and that it was you, Chebron, who killed dear Paucis. But of course I did not believe them. I knew it was all their wickedness."
"Never mind about that, dear," Chebron said. "We will talk about all this afterward. The first thing is to get you away from this place. Jethro and Amuba will soon decide what is best to be done. Are there any others in the house?"
"There is one other man," Ruth replied, "and an old woman. I think the other man is at the door with the chariot."
"I had better tell Jethro," Chebron said, and he again went into the room and told Jethro what he had heard. "We will seize the woman first," Jethro said, "and then go out round the house and come down from the other way upon the chariot. The man will have heard the outcry, and if we came suddenly out of the door, might leap into the chariot and drive off before we could overtake him. But if we come upon it from behind we shall secure him." "But you have forgotten to bind Plexo," Chebron said. "Plexo is dead," Jethro replied. "As he fell his arm was beneath him, and the knife with which he had intended to strike you pierced his heart. I am very glad that you observed the way I spoke to Amuba. It was of the greatest importance that the name should not be mentioned. This affair will cause a tremendous excitement. There is nothing to connect us with Ptylus, and it may be supposed that it is the work of some malefactors who came down from the hills in search of plunder. The fact that Mysa was here and was carried away is not in itself any proof that we had a hand in it, for Libyan robbers might well have carried her and Ruth away to make slaves of. Plexo caught but a glimpse of us, and doubtless only rushed out and called the men to come to his father's assistance. At any rate, let there be no names mentioned. Now let us finish our work here." The female servant was soon found and bound. Then the 4 prisoners were placed in different rooms, and fastened securely to the wall or pillars. "Never put 2 prisoners together," Jethro said. "Always remember that. Tie one man up and you may keep him. Tie up 2 and they are sure to escape. They can bite through each other's cords, or untie the knot with their teeth, or possibly even with their fingers."
"Now, what is the next thing to do?" Amuba asked.
"The next thing is to have a consultation. Do you, Chebron, go into the garden to the girls. Amuba and I will deal with the other man."
As soon as Jethro and Amuba had left him Chebron rejoined the girls. "You saved my life, Ruth. I shall never forget it." "You saved me from the crocodile, my lord. It was but a push and he fell. I scarce know how it was done." "Your quickness saved my life all the same, Ruth. I had not noticed him till you cried out, and then it would have been too late. We have been anxious for you also, Ruth. We hoped that you might be with Mysa, but none saw you go out with her." "My place was with my mistress," Ruth said quietly, "and she was more than a mistress, she was a friend to me." "But how came you here, Chebron?" Mysa again asked. "And why are you dressed up like a peasant woman? It is not seemly in any man, much less in you, a priest. And Amuba and Jethro, too, they are dressed as peasants, and their faces seem changed, I do not know how. They look darker, and I should not have known them had I not recognized Jethro's voice." "It is a long story, dear, and I will tell you all presently, and we want to hear your story too. Ah, here come the others. It is to them, Mysa, far more than to me that you owe your rescue. I may know more of the learning of our people, but I have none of the readiness and coolness of Amuba, while Jethro is as prudent as he is brave. It would have fared hardly with me as well as with you, Mysa, had it not been for these good friends." Mysa went up to them as they approached. "Oh, Jethro, I feel how much I owe to you, and to you, Amuba. My courage had all but given way, although Ruth strove so hard to give me hope, and I fear I could not have long withstood the threats of that bad man. You cannot tell what joy I felt when I recognized your voice."
"Our joy was as great in finding you as yours in seeing us," Jethro replied. "Amuba and I would gladly have laid down our lives for you. And now let us have a consultation. There is much to decide upon and arrange. Let us go round to the garden at the other side of the house. There we can sit and talk, and at the same time keep watch that no one else enters. It is not likely that anyone will do so, for the place is secluded, and none would know that these men were here. Still a peasant might enter to sell fowls or fruit, therefore it were best to keep an eye upon the entrance." They went round to some seats placed beneath trees on the other side of the house. A fountain worked by the water of a little rill on the hillside played in front of them, and a few tame waterfowl swam in a shallow basin around it. Everything was still and peaceful, and to Chebron it seemed as if the events of the last 3 weeks had been a hideous dream, and that they were again sitting in the garden of their house at Thebes.
"Now, first of all," Mysa said, "I must have my questions answered. How are my father and mother and everyone?"
Jethro took Amuba's arm and turned away. "We will leave you, Chebron, to tell Mysa what has taken place. It will be better for you to do so alone." Ruth rose from her seat to leave also, but Mysa put her hand on her arm.
"I am frightened, Ruth. Stay with me."
"You told me, Mysa," Chebron began, "that they had told you tales that our father was dead, and that it was I who killed Paucis."
"Yes, but I did not believe them, Chebron. Of course I did not for a moment. At least not for a moment about you. But when I thought of those bad men at the gate, and the crash we heard, and the noise of the people rushing in shouting, I was afraid that perhaps it might be true about our father. But oh, Chebron, surely it is not so."
"Alas, Mysa, it is true. They cruelly slew our father. I wish I had been there to have fallen by his side. But you know Amuba and I were away. Jethro fought desperately to the last, and would have died with him had not our father himself commanded that in case anything happened to him he was to take charge of me, and to carry me out of the land." Mysa was crying bitterly now. Presently she looked up.
"But why should you want to leave the land, Chebron? Surely it is not true that you—"
The thing seemed too terrible for her to put into words. "That I killed poor Paucis? That is true also, Mysa." Mysa gave a little cry of horror.
"Oh, Ruth!" she cried. "This is too dreadful."
Ruth put her arms round the sobbing girl.
"You may be sure, Mysa, that your brother did not do it intentionally." "But it is all the same," Mysa cried. "It was the sacred cat, you know, the cat of Bubastes."
"It was, Mysa, and I thought at first, as you did, that although it was the result of an accident the anger of the gods would be poured out against me, that I was as one accursed, whose life was forfeited in this world, and whose spirit was destined to dwell in unclean beasts after death. But when I told my father all, he reassured me, and told me not to fear in any way the wrath of the gods." He then related to his sister the manner in which the cat had been killed, the steps he and Amuba had taken to conceal the body, and his avowal to his father of his fault.
"I see it was not your fault, Chebron, but you know the laws of Egypt, and the punishment for killing even a common cat. How could our father say that the gods would not be angry?"
"I cannot tell you all he said, Mysa, though some day had I remained with you I might have done so. But he did say so, and you know how wise and good he was. Therefore I want you to remember what he said, so that when I am gone you will not all your life think of me as one accursed."
"Oh, I should never do that!"
Mysa exclaimed, starting up and throwing her arms round her brother's neck.
"How could you think so? But why are you talking about going, and where are you going?"
"I am going, Mysa, because the people of Egypt do not view this matter in the same light as my father, but are hunting all the land to find and slay me and Amuba; for, not knowing the exact truth, they put us down as equally guilty. So we must fly. Our father gave full directions to Jethro, and we should by this time have been a long distance away had it not been that we stayed to find and rescue you."
"Then if the other things they told me are true, Chebron, it may be true too that the letter they showed me ordering me to consent to marry Plexo was from my mother. How could she tell me that when she knew that I hated him, and she has over and over again spoken scornfully of his family before me?"
"What did she say?" Chebron asked.
"She said that now disgrace had fallen on the family I might think myself very fortunate in obtaining such an offer."
Chebron was silent. He knew that his mother had never shown any earnest love either for Mysa or himself, that her thoughts were entirely devoted to dress and entertainments, and that any love she had to give had been bestowed upon his brother. "I fear it is true, Mysa."
"But I will never marry Plexo!" Mysa exclaimed passionately. "My father always said I should never marry a man I disliked."
"You will never marry Plexo, Mysa. He is dead." Ruth uttered an exclamation. "He died by his own hand, Ruth, that is, by an accident. As he fell his dagger pierced his own heart, and when Jethro went to look at him he was dead."
"The Lord requited him for his evil," Ruth said firmly. "All things are in his hands. As I did not mean to slay him, I lament not over his death. Besides, he strove to take your life, and had I had a dagger in my hand I should assuredly have used it." "Then what is to become of me?" Mysa asked.
"You must go back to your mother, Mysa. There is naught else for you to do."
"I will not!" Mysa exclaimed. "She never loved me. She would have married me against my will to Plexo, although she knew he was bad, and that I hated him. She would make me marry someone else who was rich, regardless of my wishes. No, Chebron, nothing shall make me go back to her."
Chebron looked perplexed. "Here come Jethro and Amuba, dear. You had best talk it over with them. I see nothing else for you to do." As Jethro came up Mysa walked to meet him.
"I will not go back to my mother, Jethro," she exclaimed impetuously. "She wanted me to marry Plexo. She would give me to someone else, and my father always said I should only marry someone I liked. You can never be so cruel as to give me up to her."
"I know that your father's wishes were strong upon that point," Jethro said, "for he spoke to me of you when he gave me his commands respecting Chebron. He said that he wished that I could watch over you as over him, and it was because of what he had said that I disregarded his orders as to our instant flight, and lingered here in hopes of freeing you. Still I see not anything else to be done. Your mother doubtless wrote while still overpowered by grief at your father's loss, and thought that she was acting for your welfare in securing you an advantageous marriage in spite of the cloud under which your family was resting."
"I will not go to her," Mysa repeated. "She thought of herself, as she always did, and not of me in any way. You know it was so, Chebron. You cannot deny it."
Chebron was silent. His whole affection had been given to his father, for his mother he had comparatively little. As a child he had seldom been allowed to come into the room where she was. She declared that his noise was too much for her, that his talk made her head ache, and that his fidgeting about was too much to be borne. Nor since that time had he been much more with her. It was his father who had seen to his welfare and that of Mysa, who would put aside his grave studies to walk and talk with them, who was always indulgent, always anxious to give them pleasure. He therefore thoroughly entered into Mysa's feelings, but saw no possible alternative for her. "But where could you go, Mysa?" Jethro asked. "Where could you be placed? Wherever you were your mother in time would be sure to hear of it and would reclaim you."
"I shall go with Chebron and you and Amuba," Mysa said positively.
"Impossible," Jethro replied. "We are going upon a tremendous journey, full of danger and fatigue. We are going among unknown and savage peoples. The chances are 100 to 1 against our ever arriving at the end of our journey. If this is so to myself and to young men like Chebron and Amuba, for they are now past 18 and will speedily be men, what chance would there be of success with you with us?"
"I can walk as well as Chebron," Mysa said. "You know that, Chebron, and I suppose I could suffer hardship just as well. At any rate I would rather suffer anything and be with him and all of you than stop here. The people have murdered my father. My mother would sell me to the highest bidder. If the chances are so great that you will never get through your journey in safety, my being with you cannot make them so much greater. I have only Chebron in the world, and I will go where he goes and die where he dies. The gods can protect me just as well on a journey as here. Have they not protected you now, and Chebron too, by what he says? You will take me with you, dear Jethro, won't you?" she urged pleadingly. "You say my father wished you to watch over me. Do not forsake me now. Ruth will come with us too. Will you not, Ruth? I am sure she will not be more afraid of the journey than I am." "I will assuredly go if you go, Mysa. The God of Israel can take us safely through all dangers if it be his will."
Jethro was silent. Such an addition to his charge would assuredly add immensely to the difficulties of the journey, but on the other hand he remembered the anxiety of Ameres about Mysa, and he asked himself what his late master would have wished had he known how matters stood. He glanced at Amuba and Chebron and saw at once that their wishes agreed with those of Mysa. He turned away abruptly, and for some minutes paced up and down the garden. Then he returned to the group, among whom not a word had been exchanged since he left them. "Mysa," he said gravely, "this is a great thing that you ask. There is no disguising that your presence will add greatly to our difficulties, will add also to our perils, and may render it impossible for me to carry out your father's wishes and to conduct Chebron to a land where he will be beyond the persecution of Egypt. Such an enterprise must be undertaken in no light spirit. If you go you must be prepared to face death in all forms, by hunger and thirst and the weapons of the wild natives. It may even be that your lot may be that of slavery among them. It is a terrible journey for men, more terrible still for women. Still, if you are resolved with the strength and mind of a woman and not of a child, that after having once turned your back upon Egypt you will never repent the step you have taken or wish to return, but will be steadfast under all the trials that may befall us, then I say that you shall share our lot." Mysa uttered an exclamation of joy. "I promise, Jethro; and whatever may happen, hardship, danger, or death, you shall never hear a word of complaint from me. Are you not glad, Ruth?" "I think it well," Ruth said gravely. "It is a great undertaking, but I think that God's hand is in it. I, too, would fain leave this land of idols, and except those here I have none in the world to care for." "And now, Jethro," Amuba said, "what had we best do? It is already almost dark, therefore we could set out at once. Could we make use of the chariot?" Jethro considered for a short time. "Except for carrying any things we may want for our first start, I do not see that we can do so," he said. "For where we leave the chariot tomorrow morning it would be found, and when it is known that Ptylus' chariot was missing it would soon be recognized as his, and thus a clue afforded to the fact that we had fled south. As to traveling in it beyond tonight, it would be out of the question. Besides, it will only hold 3 at the most. No, if we use it at all it must be to drive north, and so throw them off the scent. I think it will be worth doing that." "I will undertake that part of the business," Amuba said. "There will be much for you to do tomorrow, Jethro, which only you can arrange. There's the boat to be hired, stores laid in, and all got in readiness. I think the best plan will be for you both to start at once with the girls for Thebes. You and Chebron can occupy your hiding place on the hill, and Chigron will be glad to take the girls into his house. There is no danger of an immediate search being made for them. Tonight, when the priest and his son do not return, their servants will suppose that they have slept here. It will not be until late tomorrow afternoon that there will be any alarm or any likelihood of a messenger being sent over here. Then the consternation and confusion that will be caused will be so great that probably no one will think of carrying the news to the officials until the next morning. Besides, until the story of Mysa's having been here and of her being missing is generally known, there is no reason that what has taken place should be attributed to us. Therefore, for the next 48 hours, I think that they would be perfectly safe at the embalmers. I will drive the chariot 30 or 40 miles north, then turn the horses loose where they are sure to be noticed ere long, and will return on foot and join you in your hiding place tomorrow night."
"I think your plan is a very good one, Amuba. Before we start I will make a search through the house. There will be nothing we want to take with us, nor would we want to touch any of the treasure of the villains were the house full of it, but if I toss some of the things about it will look as if robbery had been the motive of what has taken place. The men in bonds can know nothing of the real state of things. Plexo, when he rushed out for their aid, could have had no time to do more than to tell them to take up their arms and follow him. Indeed, it is doubtful whether he himself had any idea that we were aught but what we seemed. Therefore the first impression assuredly will be that we were malefactors of the worst kind. Escaped slaves, men with no respect for the gods, for assuredly no Egyptians, even the worst of criminals, would in cold blood have laid hands on the high priest of Osiris."
"They laid hands on my father," Chebron said bitterly.
"Yes, but not in cold blood. Reports had first been spread among them that he was untrue to the gods, and then they were maddened by fanaticism and horror at the death of that sacred cat. But in cold blood, as I said, no Egyptian, however vile and criminal, would lift his hand against a priest. You may as well come with me, Amuba. It would be strange if one of us only took part in the search."
In 10 minutes Jethro and Amuba had turned the place into confusion in forcing open chests and cabinets, and littering the floor with garments. Then taking a few of the most valuable vases and jewels, they threw them into the pond round the fountain, where they would be concealed from view by the water lilies which floated on its surface. They examined afresh the fastenings of the captives, and felt assured that by no possibility could they free themselves. "They will be sure to be freed by tomorrow night," Amuba said. "Otherwise I should not like to leave them here to die of hunger and thirst."
"I should be only too glad," Jethro said, "if I thought there was a chance of their being here 40 hours instead of 20. Doubtless this is not the first evil business they have carried out for their villain master, and they may think themselves lucky indeed that we do not take what would be in every way the safest and best course, namely to run a sword through their bodies and silence them forever."
If I thought they could tell anything I would do so now, but I really do not think that anything they can tell would add to our danger. Of course the priest's wife knows that Mysa is hidden here, and will proclaim the fact that she has been here and is now missing, as she would consider it might afford a clue for the apprehension of those who attacked the house and slew her husband and son. Therefore I do not see that there would be much to be gained by silencing these people, but if you think differently I will finish them at once." Amuba shook his head, for although human life in those days was thought little of, save by the Egyptians themselves, he shrank from the thought of slaying captives in cold blood. "No, they can tell nothing, Jethro. You had best be moving. There is nothing more to talk over. I think all our plans were arranged long ago, except of course that you must get rather a larger boat than you had intended, together with garments for the girls. I think it would be best that Chebron should still be disguised as a woman, but we can settle that tomorrow night. There is a good store of dresses for us to choose from at Chigron's." Amuba led the horses to a stone water trough and allowed them to quench their thirst. Then he mounted the chariot and drove off, while the rest of the party set out on foot for Thebes. It was so late before they reached Chigron's house that they thought it better not to arouse the inmates, as comment would be excited by the arrival of women at so late an hour and unexpected by the master. The girls, therefore, passed the night in the rock chamber behind the building, while Jethro and Chebron lay down outside. As soon as dawn broke they moved some distance away. Jethro went to the house as soon as there was a sign that there was anyone astir, and told Chigron that they had discovered and rescued Mysa. Chigron was much disturbed when he heard of the death of the high priest and his son. "I don't say these men were not villains, Jethro, but that 2 high priests should be slaughtered in the course of a month is enough to bring the anger of all the gods upon Egypt. However, the poor girls are not responsible for it in any way, and I will willingly shelter them, especially as it is but for one night. But I own that I shall be vastly relieved when I know that you are all fairly on your journey." "That I can well understand," Jethro said; "and believe me, the gratitude of those you have sheltered, which you will have as long as they live, may well outweigh any doubts that may present themselves as to whether you have acted wisely in aiding those who are victims to the superstitions of your countrymen." Chigron called his servants and told them that he had just heard of the arrival from the country of some friends, and ordered a room to be prepared for them. He then went out and returned an hour later with the 2 girls. He led them quietly into the house and direct to the apartment prepared for them, so that they were unseen by any of the servants. Then he called an old servant on whose fidelity he could rely, and charged her to wait upon them during the day, and to suffer none other to enter the apartment. He bade her convey the impression to the other servants that the visitors were aged women, and to mention that they intended to make a stay of a few hours only, until some friends with whom they were going to stay should send in a cart to carry them to their house in the country. The old woman at once prepared baths for the girls, and then supplied them with a meal, after which they lay down on couches and were soon fast asleep. For the excitement of the preceding evening and the strangeness of their position in the comfortless stone chamber had prevented their closing an eye during the night, and they had spent the hours in talking over the terrible loss Mysa had sustained and the journey that lay before them. Half an hour later Chigron went out again and was soon joined by Jethro, who had now resumed his attire as a citizen of middle class. It was necessary that Chigron should accompany him and take the chief part in making the arrangements, for although Jethro had learned, in his 2 years' captivity, to speak Egyptian fluently, he could not well pass as a native. Chigron therefore did most of the bargaining, Jethro keeping somewhat in the background. They first took their course down to the river bank. Here innumerable craft lay moored, for the Nile was the highway of Egypt, and except for short journeys all traffic was carried on its waters. As soon as it was known that they were looking for a boat they were surrounded by the owners of the various craft, each praising the speed, safety, and comfort of his boat. Chigron, however, was some time before he made his choice. Then he fixed upon a boat that seemed well suited for the purpose. She carried a mast and large sail to take advantage of favorable winds. She was light and of very small draught, and being constructed entirely for passenger traffic she had a large cabin, divided into 2 parts for the accommodation of ladies, the crew consisting of the captain and 4 men sleeping on the deck. "I think your boat will do very well," he said to the captain, "provided we can come to terms. My friend is going up with his family as far as Syene at any rate, and possibly on to Ibsciak. His business may take him even further. What will be your terms a week?" "I suppose my lord will provide food for the crew as well as for his own family?" "That will be the best way," Jethro said. "Then will he pay for extra hands where the current runs so strong that the crew cannot tow the boat unaided against it?" Jethro assented. "And will he return with it, or remain for a while at the end of his journey?" "It is probable that his business may detain him there for a considerable time," Chigron replied. "He has relations there with whom he will wish to make a stay. But this should make no difference. You will have no difficulty in obtaining passengers or freight for your journey down." It was a long time before a bargain was struck, for Chigron knew that the boatmen would consider it strange indeed were the terms he first asked to be accepted. But at last an arrangement satisfactory to both parties was concluded. It was arranged that the start should take place early on the following morning, and Chigron then proceeded with Jethro to make the purchases requisite for the voyage: mats, cushions, and curtains for furnishing the boat, cooking utensils and provisions for the crew and passengers. Of these, however, it was not necessary to take a very large quantity, as the boat would lie up to the bank every night near one of the frequent villages, and here there would be no difficulty in purchasing provisions of all kinds. Some jars of good wine were, however, among the stores purchased, and in addition to these were several bales of costly merchandise and a large stock of such articles as would be useful for trade with the natives of the wilder parts of the country. A supply of arms, bows, arrows, and lances, was also placed on board. It was late in the afternoon before all these things were got on board the boat and everything arranged in order. Having seen all complete, Chigron returned with Jethro to his house. Jethro, after seeing the girls, who had just woke up and partaken of a meal, went up to the hiding place on the hill, and found that Amuba had just joined Chebron there. "Is all going on well?" the lads asked as he entered.
"Everything is in readiness. The boat is hired and furnished. I have a good store of merchandise for trading in Meroe, besides trinkets of many kinds for the peoples lying between Meroe and the Red Sea. So far everything promises well. The boatmen belong to the Upper Nile, and their dialect differs too widely from that spoken here for them to be able to distinguish that I do not talk pure Egyptian. I wondered why it was that Chigron was such a long time in making his choice between the boats, when, as far as I could see, there were scores that would have equally suited our purpose. But I found afterward that it was the boatmen rather than the boat which he was selecting, and that he chose those coming from far up the river, partly because their speech differed so widely from that of Thebes that they would not detect the roughness of my tongue, and secondly because they would be more likely to continue the voyage further to the south than would the boatmen of this port, who would regard it as a serious undertaking to proceed beyond Ibsciak. Therefore we need fear no suspicion on the part of our boatmen. I suppose you disposed of the chariot as we arranged, Amuba?"
"Yes, I drove north for 5 hours and then turned aside into a wood. Here I loosed the horses so that they could feed as they chose. They would doubtless by morning stray into the fields, and so attract attention. Then there would be a search to see to whom they belonged, and the chariot would be found. By the time that the news spreads that Ptylus is dead, and also that his chariot and horses are missing, and have doubtless been taken off by those who had attacked him, the tidings that the chariot is found will have been taken to the nearest town, and it will shortly be reported all over the country that we are making north, and the search for us will be made in that direction only. Are you going back to the house, Jethro?"
"Yes. Chigron has given out to his servants that the visitors are relatives of mine, and as I have been frequently seen going in and out in this garb, they are now accustomed to me, and it will be natural for me to sleep there tonight, and to start with them in the morning. We shall start exactly at sunrise. You had better wait at a distance from the house and follow us, coming up and joining us just as we reach the riverside. The boat will be taken above the city to the highest steps, and we shall be able to proceed to that point without entering the town itself. Be careful with your disguises. The news of the death of Ptylus will not, I hope, be generally known in the city until we are fairly afloat. Were it otherwise it would be dangerous for you to run the risk of being seen abroad." Chapter 16